Hey guys, first I want to start off by thanking David Scow for sending in your $50 donation for William's headstone. So for you and anybody else who donates, send me your mailing address so I can send you a copy of this book and an invitation to the gravesite memorial. Just go ahead and contact me through my website. There's always a link to it in the video description. So just go to my website, click on contact, and you can email me through there. Thank you so much, and I'm so excited for the day we get to put down that headstone. Thanks for being a part of this experience. So today's chapter is going to cover a period of 2 years. The author crams 2 years into one chapter, while even going back in time and sharing some pretty crazy experiences and events that hadn't been told in the book up until this point. So bear with me. Today's chapter is going to take us for a wild ride. Are you ready? Let's get reading. Chapter 16. Jonathan came for Sarah a week later. She was packed and ready to go. Her mother stood near the cart after she was seated with little Will in her arms. Poor girl, she doesn't know what she's in for. Martha wiped a tear from her eye as she watched them drive off. Mrs. Sims was watching for them as Jonathan stopped in front of the door. She greeted Sarah with, "We're glad you're here, Sarah. We've curtained off this east corner for you. It's on a wire, so you can draw it open or shut when you wish." Noting the collapsible crib Sarah was trying to balance in front of her as she walked, carrying the child in the other arm. "What in the world is that?" "I'll show you." Laying the child on the cot that was to be her bed and holding the top ring, she took out the crib and let it fall to its standing position. She took up her child and lay him in it. "Well, I declare! How nice! Never saw anything like it. My baby's uncle had it made for him by an Indian woman. My husband left instructions of what you are to do before he left." Jonathan came in bearing the box containing Sarah's belongings. Noting the crib, he exclaimed, "Now ain't that something?" testing its rocking ability gently with one hand. "Cutest thing I ever saw," as he turned his wide, friendly smile toward Sarah. Then, turning toward the door, "I'm the man around here now. Gotta get back to work," squaring his shoulders. "I'm going to run this farm good as Pa. Maybe even better," as he disappeared out the door. Sarah turned to his mother. "I'll clear the table and do the dishes first. Shall I, ma'am?" "No, right now there's so much that must be done. I'll work in here. You best go out to the barn and help Jonathan with the pork first thing. Yesterday my husband killed 2 pigs, big ones. Then got up at 4 this morning and cut them in half so that you and Jonathan could cut them up and salt them down into the pork barrel this morning. Here, put on this heavy canvas apron and go. I'll do what I can in here." She looked tired and drawn, thought Sarah. 2 large hogs, most meat she'd seen since the men on the plains came in from a buffalo hunt. She tied on the apron and hurried toward the barn. Jonathan was already busy cutting halves into quarters. "What can I do to help?" she asked as she glanced around the meat section of the barn. It was a well-built structure, better in many ways than the house, practically new and partitioned off into several different sections. Jonathan was struggling with the huge chopping block, trying to move it, but it did not budge. It stood on 3 wooden legs and was cut from the whole circumference of a tree, about 2.5 feet in diameter, the type used in butcher shops to cut up large sections of meat. It was about 20 inches thick, resembling a table, only far heavier. The boy looked up and said, "It's too heavy to move, but you can help me move this pork barrel closer to it, and then you can salt the pieces as I cut them and place them in the barrel. First a thin layer of salt, and then a layer of meat." Then he added, "There's an extra butcher's knife there. We must trim all excess fat off first and put it to one side for lard." "Oh," thought Sarah, "what a wonderful lot of meat. Wouldn't Mother love even a taste of it?" But she said nothing. Jonathan had taken up the meat saw and was cutting neatly through the rib section to make chops, roasts, throwing the smaller bits into a large bucket for sausage. There would be 4 beautiful hams and 4 shoulder hams when they had them all cut. He explained as they worked how his mother would render out the lard from the fat, and how they would grind the smaller bits for sausage, how they must salt, cure, and smoke the hams and hang them in the barn with netting over them for use during the winter. Sarah caught on to just how to salt and place the pieces. He handed her into the pork barrel, layer after layer. "This is the finest pork I have ever seen in all my life," she offered. "You must have fed and cared for them well to have meat like this." "Yes, my father's a good farmer, and we have all the meat and milk and eggs, stuff like that. Also vegetables we raise. Back in Nauvoo, we had a big farm and raised all our own stuff. My father is good at all this kind of work. We brought this chopping block with us from Nauvoo, and the meat saw and the butcher knives." "Looks to me like you're pretty good at this yourself." "Yes, he taught me to do this. I've helped since I was about 10. I think it's wonderful the way you handle that knife and saw. And what's that wide blade thing? Looks like a hatchet, but that's a cleaver, to chop through a partly cut bone or to split the heavier bones, like when you cut the hog in half." He seemed so pleased to have someone to talk to who showed an interest in him and his work. "Oh, what would Mother say if she saw all of this beautiful meat? We haven't tasted meat for—" She clapped her hand over her mouth, realizing she had spoken her thoughts out loud. There was silence between them for several minutes, and then the boy paused in his work and turned to her. "Look here, Sarah. Now that Pa's gone, I'm in charge here. He said so himself. He told me to take one of the hams to the tithing office, and a good-sized roast with it soon as possible. Tell you what I'll do. I'll take a bit of meat to your mother when I go, and it will be just between you and me. No need to bother Ma with it." "But would it be right? I wouldn't want you to do anything." "Just leave it to me. I feel that having you here to take care of Ma and all the other things you have to do is worth far more than we are paying you." Sarah wanted to throw her arms around him and kiss him. Just a boy he was, the mark of true manhood, displayed by his thinking and reasoning, and it touched her deeply. There was so much she wanted to say, but couldn't. So she worked on. David, aged 10, came to call them for dinner. They ate well, thought Sarah, as she drank the glass of milk and ate the creamed corn with pork liver and onions. Oh, how good it all tasted, and she was so hungry. She and Jonathan returned directly to work. "If we work fast, maybe we can make this sausage tonight, and I can go to the tithing office tomorrow." Saying this as they prepared to go back to work, he looked across at Sarah to see if she caught this meaning. She had, and looked quickly away as she felt the tears pushing themselves behind her lids, and visioned her mother enjoying the wondrous treat she was about to receive. But it was 3 days before Jonathan could go into the city. They did not finish all the cutting up that night, though they worked until dark. They made sausage the next afternoon. The nights were cool, and the barn kept the meat in good condition. The final delay was that the brindle heifer went into labor with her first calf that evening. Sarah helped the boy care for her. She held the lighted lantern for him as he helped ease the new calf from its struggling mother's body. Then they wrapped the calf in an old blanket to keep the chill off until it was dry and could be left snuggling up to its mother. It was past midnight when the two made their weary way to the house and to rest. Little Will was whimpering and fussing, so Sarah took him into bed with her and fell asleep as she nursed him. Never had she been so tired. This farm work was no joke. She had put in 15 hours of hard labor this day. Then came the comforting thought that her mother was about to receive fresh meat, be it ever so little, and a few other goodies Jonathan had added. She fell asleep with these comforting thoughts and did not waken until almost 8 next morning. Jonathan had already left for the tithing office. She dressed quickly, cared for her babe, and stepped from behind the curtain corner into the living room where Mrs. Sims and the 3 younger children were finishing breakfast. "Thought I'd let you sleep a bit this morning, seeing you got in so late last night," from Mrs. Sims. "Thanks, ma'am," answered Sarah as she took the dipper on the washstand and poured fresh water into the bowl and washed her face and hands. I don't think I have ever been quite so tired as I was last night. Oh, how's the new calf and its mother this morning? Jonathan checked this morning, and they are both fine. The calf's a heifer and is up nursing, so they'll both be all right now, I think. Sarah's whole body felt stiff and sore, but she knew she must not complain. She took up a dish of the hot-cooked cereal, cracked wheat raised on the farm, carried it to the table, and sat down to eat. What about the calf? Will you keep it or use it for food? It's a heifer, so we'll raise it. We need another good milk cow. That's what my husband said we should do. Sarah worked inside until after lunch when Jonathan returned. She did a huge washing and was weary, yet they went right to work. She saw Jonathan give the tithing receipt to his mother. Then he hurried out ahead of Sarah to check on the cow and calf. He had left instructions for David to keep an eye on the cow and James to do the milking and feed the animals. He really proved himself to be a good manager and left nothing to chance. He had put the big wash tub on the fireplace and had James fill it with water and start the fire under it, so it was hot when she went out to wash. It took only a short time to finish cutting up the fat for lard and soap. This done, he told her to go back and help in the house. He could manage the rest. Everyone washed outside those first few years and did it all by hand. No washing machines, only a washboard, if one was lucky enough to have one. Otherwise, they punched the clothes with a heavy rounded stick and rubbed the worst soil with soap and by hand. If there was no clothesline, they hung the wash on bushes. The Sims had lines, but not enough for so huge a wash, so both lines and bushes were laden. The clothes dried quickly this time of year, and Sarah had them gathered in and most of the ironing done by late afternoon. The pioneers made their own soap and their own lye. The latter was made from wood ashes, carefully sifted, then placed in a huge crock or barrel, and boiling water was poured over the ashes and left to settle overnight. Then the clear lye liquid was carefully poured off without disturbing the ashes. They were experts at this and at soap making. Sarah was tired to the bone when called to supper. Jonathan caught up with her. "I took the stuff to your mother," he said, almost in a whisper. "Oh, thank you so much," came her soft reply. "How are they?" "Fine," he said, and wanted to know how you are. I told them fine. They could smell the aroma of roast pork as they neared the open door and went inside. Little Will was fussing in his crib. Sarah washed hands and face and hurried to him. Such a good baby, so neglected at times, but he kept well. "You go ahead without me. I'll take care of him first," she said, as she stretched out on her cot to feed the child. She fell fast asleep from utter exhaustion. The family had finished their meal when she woke and ate her meal all alone. "Sorry," she said. "I'm just not quite up to the pace I've been going lately." "It's all right." Mrs. Sims was still sitting at the table, looking tired and worn. "Your food is on the back of the stove. Seems like there's always so much to do, and lately things have been getting ahead of us. It's hard on us all. Sit down and enjoy your food." The short nap had refreshed Sarah, and she was very hungry. "This all tastes so good." Then she added, "Now why don't you go lie down, and I'll clear up the dishes and put the little ones to bed." "Think I will," came the reply as she eased herself up laboriously. And so passed the days, one by one, full of hard work, especially for Sarah, who tried to carry the brunt for her mistress, as well as help Jonathan with what she could. "I'd never have the abundance of good food anywhere else," she told herself, "and I need it to properly feed my baby and to keep up my own strength. If only I can keep well, I can stand anything so long as my child and I don't get sick." And so she did. Every day she worked from dawn until night, and sometimes far into the night. They made soap but once a year in the late fall, after the slaughtering of the hogs. They used all the fat saved from mutton and beef as well. This year there would be at least 3 batches to be made, and it was up to her to get it done after the regular day's work, usually at night. It was made outdoors using the same fireplace and a huge metal tub or kettle placed directly over the flame. It was there, by the light of the blazing fire, that Sarah read The Scottish Chiefs by Jane Porter. She found the book on the beam above her bed. There were several books there. Her father had taught her the love of good literature and the value of remembering the author's name, especially if well impressed with the work. Both her parents had been well educated in England. Both loved music and could play instruments. In fact, her father played both the violin and the clarinet and was a fine tenor. Finding this book was a real treat. She herself had almost no musical training, but loved music and could carry a tune once she learned the words. Her father had instilled in her the responsibility of finishing what she had begun. Never leave a job half done. She could hear his voice now as she stirred the boiling mixture that would soon be ready for the lye and turn into soap. I took him so for granted, she said quietly to herself as she worked. Then all at once he was gone. Oh, the pain of knowing she would never see or hear him singing softly to himself as he worked. Then came Will, and he eased the pain of my loss. But then I lost him too. I thought he would live forever here with me. Now they are both gone. All I have left is little Will. I wonder why the Lord took my Will. I can't understand it. All we pioneers have great trials. I know that. But sometimes I feel like he singled me out just to see how much I could stand. Mrs. Moore would say I shouldn't even think such things, but the thoughts come just the same. So now I'm 17, a wife, a widow, and a mother. Well, so far I have managed, and with the help of God, I will go on and do my best, for so long as I live. She read and stirred and thought. I won't try to look too far into the future. Perhaps when the 2 years are up, Charles will come back, and I'll marry him if he still wants me. I don't think I could ever marry anyone else, not after Will. One thing sure, never will I marry in polygamy. It's fine for those who can, but I know I could never stand it. So ran her thoughts as she sat alone out by the fire, reading, stirring, and thinking. In the daytime, whenever possible, she took little Will in his crib with her. It was now mid-November, and Mrs. Sims was due to deliver at any time. It was planned that as soon as her pains began, Jonathan would be sent into town for the doctor. Then, one day, a week later, as she was cutting into squares the last batch of soap, a cry came from the kitchen. "Sarah! Sarah, come quick!" She ran toward the house, calling to David to run for Jonathan at once. "Hurry!" she cried, as she saw Mrs. Sims slump forward in the doorway. "The water broke," moaned the woman as Sarah half lifted, half dragged her to her bed. "The baby is coming. Oh, what shall we do?" "What is it?" cried Jonathan, all out of breath. "Oh, it's Ma! I'll go for the doctor," turning and running back to the barn. "Hurry as quick as you can. No time to lose," called Sarah. "It's going to be a dry birth. That means it won't be easy," she thought. To her patient, she said out loud, "Try to relax between pains. Take deep breaths. I'm not a real nurse, but I've helped Mrs. Moore, and I learned a lot from her. I'll help you all I can. We'll get your outer clothes off, and then I'll put water on and stir up the fire." At that moment, James came to the door. "Jonathan sent me to get the kids and tend them. I'll take them to the packing shed, so don't worry, I'll take good care of them." "Good, and take that loaf of bread and fill the pitcher with milk, and take some bowls and spoons and give them their supper. That will help a lot. There's a large square of oilskin sheeting on the top shelf of the south wall," came from Mrs. Sims. "Put it under me, and it will save the bedding from being spoiled. There's clean sheets and things there, too," she gasped. "I'll find them," said Sarah. There was something of calm in her voice that reassured the sufferer, who was terrified of what might happen before the doctor could arrive. She sank on the bed as the next pain struck with renewed violence. Thus passed the first hour, then the second. An agonizing shriek from the bed brought Sarah running. She raised the sheet and looked closely at the birth canal. She could see the crown of a tiny head trying to force its way into the world. Sarah breathed a sigh of relief. "It's going to be a normal birth," she said. As Mrs. Moore would say, that means fewer complications. She replaced the sheet. Then, leaning over the patient, she said quietly, "Do you have any brandy in the house? You need it. And you need it now. Mrs. Moore always uses it toward the end of hard labor. It helps ease the pain and relaxes you." Without waiting for an answer, she went on, "Just tell me where it is, and I'll make you a toddy." "On the beam above my bed," came the weak answer. Sarah climbed on a stool and reached the bottle. It was encased in a woven basket-like covering. Only the green glass top, containing the cork, extended above the woven part. It was about 1/4 full. She hurried to the table and poured a part of capful into the one glass she could find. Then filled the glass with hot water, adding a teaspoonful of honey, and stirred it carefully. Placing her left arm under the pillow, she gently raised her patient's head to where she could sip the hot liquid. The glass was gradually drained between pains, which were now less than a minute apart. A choked "Thank you" was her reward. "Breathe deeply, even if it hurts. You'll get through it faster. You'll get through it faster that way, and with less pain. There, hold it. Now let it out and push hard. That's it. The head is coming through. There, now again, the same way." Perspiration was pouring from both patient and nurse, unnoticed. Again and again they went through the same procedure until all at once the child was born. "Oh my gosh!" exclaimed Sarah, as she reached to take the infant, and discovered that another head was presented. "It's twins!" came from her trembling lips, for though she had exhibited a calm exterior to her patient, as had been drilled into her by her teacher, her heart was beating a loud tattoo against her ribs. There were tears in her eyes as the second child finally made its debut, with a thin wail piercing the night air. She carefully tied the 2 cords and cut them. She proceeded to bathe the babies, the first a little girl with lots of dark hair, and the other a boy. Then she cared for the mother, changed the bedding, and sponged her patient as best she could, making all 3 comfortable. Just as she herself was sinking down on the cot to catch her breath, in walked the doctor. Jonathan had tied the horse to a post and was close behind. "Light the lamp, will you, Jonathan?" he said as he entered with, "How's Ma?" As he obeyed, the doctor walked over to the bed and looked down at Mrs. Sims, resting comfortably, then at the 2 infants. His bag slipped from his grasp to the floor as he caught his breath and gasped, "Well, of all things, is this your work?" Turning to Sarah, he examined both mother and babies and exclaimed, "You've done a wonderful job. No one could have done this any better." "Thanks," came from Sarah, but she was really too tired to care any more. Mrs. Sims was up and around again in 2 weeks, thin and unable to work. Then her milk did not agree with the babies, and they became very ill. Jonathan was sent to get the doctor. "Your milk is poisoning the infants. They need to have a wet nurse. I don't think they can survive otherwise." "Perhaps I can nurse them along with my baby," came unexpectedly from Sarah, for neither Doctor nor Mrs. Sims had connected her with their need. "Oh, would you?" came from the distraught mother. "That's it. Of course," exclaimed the doctor. "It's the only thing that will save them, at least until they get strong enough to take some artificial feeding. How very lucky you are to have her right here. Money can't buy services like that. My hat's off to you, young lady, and may God bless you." As soon as he was gone, Sarah took the whimpering infants one at a time and offered them a feeding. They nursed ravenously, almost it seemed without breathing, then fell asleep in her arms, satisfied, comforted, and more peaceful than since the day they were born. "Drink all the milk you can," urged Mrs. Sims. "I am truly grateful to you." They slept for 6 hours before awakening. Then Sarah fed them again. "I am so grateful, Sarah. I'd pay you if I could." "Why don't you give her that little heifer calf? At least that'd be a start," suggested Jonathan. "Yes, you're right. But what would your father say?" "What could he say? First Sarah helps with the calf, and then she delivers our babies alone without any help. Now she's feeding them to keep them alive." "You're right, son. Sarah, the calf is yours as of today." "What you gonna name her?" queried David. "Don't know. Haven't had time to think. Let's see. How would Daisy do?" "Oh, yes," came a chorus from all the children. "That reminds me, Ma," put in Jonathan. "Remember both you and Pa promised me that if we got a girl, I could name her?" "Yes, I remember. But she's been so sick, and we've all been so busy. We just haven't got around to choosing a name for her. I'm naming her, remember? And I've got her name all picked out." "What is it?" came all the voices at once. "I named her Sarah," he announced proudly. "Sarah? Sarah?" "Yes, that's it. Sarah just fits her perfectly." The children and their mother were all speaking at once. Sarah sat perfectly still, startled yet deeply touched by their show of love and appreciation toward her. "All right," agreed the mother. "Next Sunday we will ask the bishop to name and bless her. And we'll name her for you, Sarah." "But what will the boy's name be?" cried James. "I've had that chosen for a long time. It's Jason," answered his mother. Finally Sarah spoke, as the family all looked toward her. "Thanks to all of you," she said. "I've never had anything like this happen to me before, and I'm overwhelmed by it all." "You shouldn't be." Jonathan spoke for them all. "You deserve all the thanks and appreciation we can give you, and little Sarah will have a real ideal to look up to in you as, shall I say, her fairy godmother." Later, when he had a chance to speak privately with her, he said, "Whenever I go into town for supplies or to the bishop's office, I'm going to take some little food stuff to your mother. I know they need it, and we owe you far more than we can ever pay. Ma and the babies might all be dead by now, but for you and your great help when we all needed you so." "Thanks, Jonathan," was all she could say as her voice broke. She kept her face averted that he might not see the tears. She could see her mother enjoying the little extra she would get, as this was pay enough, she thought. The days slipped into weeks. She was always busy, washing, ironing, mending, cleaning. She was also trying to feed little Will very small portions of food other than what she could give him, and still help the twins. It seemed to agree with him, and all three infants were well once more. She found Milton's Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained, also Jane Porter's Thaddeus of Warsaw, on the top beam above her bed. These she read one at a time as she nursed the babies. He never would have permitted her mother to do the one thing that she could never forgive. She had kept the secret to herself, except for Mrs. Moore, who knew at the time because of her part in the event. It had to do with polygamy, and had left her with such a dread, nay, actual fear in her heart, that she could never fully erase it from her memory. It happened very soon after the news of her father's death had reached them. She had come in from a day of nursing with Mrs. Moore to find a man talking to her mother. She guessed his age to be about 40 or more. He arose when she entered. "Sit down, Sarah," said her mother. "I've been talking to Brother Lyman Smith Hutchings. We have been considering your future." Her voice was strained. "My future?" she exclaimed, startled, apprehensive. "Now, Sarah, listen to me. Winter is coming, and when it does, we'll have a dreadful struggle to get through it. Brother Hutchings wants to have you sealed to him. Not to live with him, just sealed. And then he can take care of us, and we can all survive. He promises to take you to the president's office and have the ordinance performed and bring you straight back home. He will not claim you for his wife until 2 years later." "No, Mother, I don't want to. Father would never." "Yes, I know. But your father is no longer here or even alive. This will be a sure way for you, for us all, to be taken care of." A look of fear mingled with disbelief overcame the girl as her face whitened. She was trembling from head to foot. "Look here, my girl," began Hutchings. No, I'm not your girl." But the man cut in. "I see this has come as a real surprise to you, but I'm not going to hurt you. I only want to help. Don't you see? I can take care of the 3 of you. I have enough and to spare. Remember, your poor mother is a widow and can't possibly pay rent and feed you all otherwise." No, I don't want to. Never, Mother." "Well," said Hutchings, rising, "I see she's upset. It's come as somewhat of a surprise to her, but I'll leave you to talk with her, Sister Mills. My offer still stands. I like the girl, and I see no other way for you and your girls to get through the winter. Someone must help out, and I'm ready and willing." Then turning to Sarah, "I'll see you soon, I hope. I'll see you soon, I hope, young lady." She still stood, trembling and angry, nor did she raise her head or glance in his direction. When the door closed behind him, she turned to her mother. "How could you do such a thing to me?" she cried. "Sarah, listen to me. You don't know what real hunger is. I don't want you to suffer nor carry. We are all alone now, no man to care for us, and winter will soon be upon us. What else can we do? This man is well off, and he likes you. And he promises that after the sealing, you can come straight back home and live right here with us until you want to go to him." All this happened before Will had come to the valley. She remembered the fear and the pleading in her mother's voice and eyes. She was terrified. Never had she been able to handle a crisis. Father had always been the one on whom she depended. She felt helpless and distraught, grasping at straws. Thus Sarah, against her will, but for love of her kin, consented to go through with the plan. "Sold for a miserable mess of pottage," she muttered to herself. Less than a week later, the man had returned with his horse and buggy, dressed in his best, and had taken Sarah to the president's office, and Brigham Young spoke the words that sealed her to Lyman Smith Hutchings. This had been early in August. Her looks belied her age, and the president had not questioned her then. All prior arrangements had been made by Hutchings. "You're actually my wife now," were the words she remembered from this big, well-dressed stranger, as he helped her back into the buggy. She kept her hands tightly clasped in her lap, and neither answered nor glanced in his direction, until suddenly she looked up and realized they were going in the opposite direction than to her home. "Where are you taking me?" she cried in fear and alarm. "Just for a little ride," he answered, flicking the horse with the tip of the buggy whip. "I want no ride. Just take me home as you promised." "All in good time," was his answer. The horse was traveling at a fast trot in a northeasterly direction. On and on they went. The road became little more than a trail. Finally they came to a stop, far up in the foothills, surrounded by oak brush and scrub pines. There sat a newly built cabin. He alighted quickly and tied the horse to a tree. Sarah was already climbing out by herself, with the one thought of escape on foot. But he caught her in his arms as her foot touched the ground. With one arm tightly about her waist, he half led, half dragged her to the door, and drew from his pocket a key which he fitted to the lock, and the door swung inward. Pushing her in ahead of him, he reached up above her head to the deadbolt above and dropped the heavy plank into place. Sarah had known fear before. The young Indian chief was one of those times. But what she felt now was fear fraught with a terrible kind of anger. She stood perfectly still, her head lifted, and looked him straight in the eye. Her mouth was a thin white line across the center of her white face. He looked back into her blazing eyes and said, "You're beautiful, the most beautiful female I've ever seen, and you're mine," as he caught her to him in an almost savage embrace. Then, realizing her, he said, "Wait here, my love, just a moment while I change into something more comfortable," as he disappeared into the adjoining room, pushing the door shut behind him, secure in the knowledge that she could not open the one he had locked. "God, help me," she prayed silently, as her eyes flew around the four walls of the room. Then she spied the window on the west. She tiptoed swiftly toward it and tugged with all her might. It did not budge at first, but she prayed again, "Please, dear God, help me." As she did so, it gave to her struggle, and she raised it and squeezed herself out, ripping her dress as she slid to the ground. Gathering her skirts about her ankles, she began to run through the wooded area southwestward. On and on she ran, through brush, rocks, sagebrush, for what seemed miles, avoiding the road, but going toward the city as best she could. Finally she saw a few houses, cabins mostly, ready to hide or to scream for help should her captor catch up with her. Just minutes after her escape, Hutchings re-entered the room, clad only in his underwear and a thick brown bathrobe held in place by a silken rope about his waist. He was barefoot and was speaking as he entered. "Sarah, my dear, I intend to make you mine in reality, not just in name only. Then I will take you back to—" "Sarah, Sarah, where are you?" His tone became an angry roar as he noted the empty room and the open window. By the time he could dress and go after her, he knew she would be almost impossible to find. Knowing she would seek help and tell her story sooner than be taken by him. Finally, she reached that part of the city which looked familiar to her. She made her way straight to Mrs. Moore's cabin. No one was home, but the door was unlocked. She hesitated only a moment and then went inside. She must hide, she thought desperately. Where? There was only one place, under the big bed in the far corner. She flattened herself onto the floor and crawled as far as possible under the bed toward the wall, pulling her torn skirt under and tucking it in so it did not show. She lay flat on her back, for how long she never knew. She was utterly exhausted, face and hands scratched, clothing torn. She lost consciousness in sleep. It was dark when she awoke and heard Mrs. Moore walking about. There was a knock on the door, and in rushed her mother. "Have you seen Sarah?" came her frightened, agitated cry. "Sarah? What do you mean? Is she lost?" Martha was holding Carrie by the hand. Sarah heard her blurt out the details of what had taken place that morning. "And she's not back yet," sobbed her mother. "He promised he'd bring her straight back after the sealing, but he didn't. I haven't seen either of them since. She's run away. I know she's run away, and it's my fault." "Martha, how could you do such a thing?" burst from her friend's lips. "Poor Sarah. Poor dear Sarah. How could you?" "I don't know. I just don't know. What shall I do?" "We'll go right now to the bishop's home and tell him. He'll know what's best to be done. He'll help us find her." "No need to do that," came from Sarah as she pulled herself out from under the bed and struggled to a sitting position on the floor. The two women stared down at her, speechless. "Sarah, Sarah," cried her mother at last, dropping down beside her. "What ever happened to you?" He took me far out of town, up into the foothills. He has a cabin there, a place I never knew existed. He tried to, but I got away from him and ran as fast as I could and hid along the way till I got here." The memory of it all flooded back upon her now as she nursed the infants and relived the worst experience she had ever known. "The Lord has surely been good to me in many ways," she thought. "He saved me from that dreadful man. I prayed, and he answered and delivered me. And the bishop was so good. He went at once to President Young and explained what had happened, and the president had the sealing canceled that very day. The next morning after I ran away, the 10th of August, 1854. It's there on the church records of cancellations of sealings. I never told anyone, not even my will. I intended to someday, but the chance never came. Well, I suppose he knows now. He knows all things about me now. Oh, how I miss him." On and on went her thoughts. As winter closed in and the days grew shorter and colder, the children could no longer play outside. Often they gathered around Sarah as she fed the babies, begging for stories. They liked best the ones she told of her young childhood and of crossing the ocean, being blown off course and lost at sea for several weeks. Usually she obliged them, and even the mother became interested as she told them her personal experiences. "Tell us when you were blind," begged David. "Ma hasn't heard that one." "Well, it was like this. When I was about 3 years old, I had the measles very bad, and it left me totally blind. My folks did everything they knew or thought might help, such as having my ears pierced and a pair of gold earrings fastened in them. My Uncle William Mills bought the earrings, and each one had a small but very beautiful diamond in it. My mother had hired a nurse for me, and one day she took me to the store with her to buy something. She left me out in my cart in the sunshine while she went inside. An old gypsy woman who had seen her go in caught sight of the diamond earrings. saw that I was alone, and came up to me, put forth her 2 hands, and took hold of those earrings, one in each hand, and ripped them off, tearing right through my earlobes. I screamed and cried. Hannah, my nurse, came running out of the store. She saw the blood streaming from my ears, and caught sight of the gypsy as she was running away. She couldn't go after her and care for me at the same time, so the gypsy got away. I never saw the lovely earrings, but I cried so hard over their loss that my father bought me a second pair, but they tell me the diamonds were not so large and perfect as the first. I still have the scars of where the first ones were torn out. Then what happened? Chorused the children. None of the remedies they tried did the least bit of good. I was totally blind for 2 years. Then the missionaries came to Douglas, Isle of Man, where we lived, and my father met John Taylor. He converted my parents, and my father was the 3rd man baptized there by the Mormon missionaries who first came to the Isle of Man. I was about 6 years old then. When the missionaries learned of my blindness, they called a fast and prayer meeting for me by all members. There weren't many, but every one of them participated. They all fasted for about 24 hours. Mother left me home with Hannah. It was in the afternoon toward sundown when the fast and prayer meeting closed. Hannah told Mother she was sitting by my bed, and I began to cry. Not aloud, but she said tears ran down my cheeks. She stooped to wipe them away, and I opened my eyes and looked at her, and I could see. Hannah's face was the first thing I saw, and I've had my sight since that day. On another evening, she told them of their crossing the ocean. We left Isle of Man and went to Liverpool with the converts who were sailing for the States. Out of our way, we stopped at Kent to bid my mother's folks goodbye. When we knocked at the door, her mother came and opened it. She had learned that we had joined the church. There was a great deal of hatred for Mormons there at that time, and my grandmother took one look at us and exclaimed, "Take your brats and go to America. We never want to see you again now that you have joined those dang Mormons." She slammed the door in our faces. We left without going back, and I never saw my grandmother again. Years later, I tried to trace her genealogy. We have never been able to find anything on her or her people at all, except that my grandfather met her on the battlefield at that one dreadful day when the Battle of Waterloo took place. He was an English soldier. She was what is known as a French canteen girl. She, with others like her, went around the great battle, which lasted but 1 day, and was won by the British. They went around and poured water from their canteens into the mouths of the wounded and dying soldiers of both sides. Then, when all the water in her canteen was gone, she took her hands and caught the blood of those dying in her cupped hands and poured it into the parched mouths of those still alive. I have heard my mother relate this about her mother many times. So she must have been a fine, compassionate person who had simply been misled by the awful tales told about the Mormons. "Don't you even know her name?" asked Mrs. Sims. "Only her first name. It was Mary. All I know is that she and my grandfather, William Hall, fell in love that day. He persuaded her to go back to Chatham, Kent, which must have been his home, and they were married. I don't even know if they had any other children besides my mother. She never told me, and I never heard her mention any brothers and sisters, though there could have been some." "I don't like stories with unhappy endings," complained James. "But some stories have to end that way, because that's the way it was." "I like the one about when you got kidnapped by the Indians." Sarah laughed and patted the boy on the head. "Bedtime now. You've heard the Indian story enough times. I'll tell you more about when we got to America another time." On another evening she told them, "If you'll all sit down and be very quiet so your mother can rest, I'll tell you about when we crossed the ocean." "Oh, we want to hear that one." "I was nearly 7, I guess. We left England from Liverpool and were, such a long time on the sea. Our ship was blown off course, and we were blown way off course and lost at sea. There was a little red-headed boy about my age or a little older. He had heard about the equator and wanted to see it. Every day he'd follow the captain around and ask him if we were there yet. always the captain would put him off. The boy got more and more insistent. One day the captain and his mate were looking through a pair of binoculars, trying to see if they could tell where we were, and the little boy grasped the captain's leg and cried, "Do you see it? Please, please, let me look." So the captain handed him the instrument and helped him fit it to his vision. Just then the mate, with a wide grin on his face, reached down and plucked a shiny red hair from the boy's head and held it in front of the lens. "Oh," he cried, "I see it, I see it, and there's a camel walking across it." Mrs. Sims and the older boys burst out laughing, but little David only said, "Wish I could have been there and seen it too," which brought more laughter from the others. "How long were you lost at sea?" asked James. "I'm not sure now, but it was several weeks, and we ran out of meat. Never shall I forget the day they decided to slaughter one of the hogs they were taking to America so that we could have food. But the pig got away from them and they had to chase it all over. Finally they caught it. But do you know, I refused to eat any at all at first because I had felt sorry for that poor thing. But in a day or two, I got so hungry that I did eat some. Well, we finally got back on course. I don't know how, and made it to New Orleans. I shall always remember walking up the street there, where they were auctioning off slaves. One poor young mother had a baby about a year old in her arms, and they had her climb upon the auction block. As she did, so she caught sight of my mother, holding my baby brother, and she cried out to her, "Oh, lady, you have such a kind face. Won't you please buy me and my baby so they won't take him away? Please, please." And my mother answered her, "I would if I could, but I have no money either." And she took me by the hand and hurried me away. I can remember seeing many, many Negroes, some with chains around one leg to keep them from running away. Men mostly. The women were all quite young and frightened. Their masters had whips in their hands to flick any who hesitated or disobeyed an order. The slave trade was thriving there. It's where they bought and sold slaves most every day, we were told. We didn't stay in one place very long. We were trying to get to Nauvoo as soon as we could. My father bought 2 covered wagons and 2 yokes of oxen when we were preparing to cross the plains, and that took all his money. He worked wherever and whenever he could get work. We all loved Nauvoo. My father was commissioned to make the horns and the hooves of the oxen for the temple, and he was given a wooden replica of a horn and a hoof. From these he made a metal mold exactly like the wooden ones. He soldered it to the oxen in the basement of the temple, same with the horns, till he had them all done. As you know, the oxen held up the baptismal font placed on their backs. There were 12 oxen representing the 12 tribes of Israel. They were placed to form a circle. Each one faced outward. I was not old enough to be baptized in it. And then later, when it was destroyed, oh, how the people did mourn. "Yes," agreed Mrs. Sims. "We were new converts and got there about, well, not quite a year before it was burned. We lived on the outskirts and had a farm going. We were just getting well on our feet when the saints were driven out. Wherever we went, my husband always started a farm. That's his life. He loves it, and that's what he's always done." "Strange," commented Sarah, "how all these old memories come flooding back once one starts reviving them." Sarah worked for the Sims almost 2 years. It was the early part of the second winter that she caught pneumonia from exposure. They called it lung fever in those days. She was very ill. Uncle William Mills had her transferred to his home, and as she grew steadily worse, a fast and prayer meeting was held in her behalf. Once more, as if by a miracle, she recovered. She was unable to return to the Simses' farm, and it was nearing the time for Brother Sims to return from his mission. It was Jonathan who drove into town and brought Mrs. Moore back with him, and it was she who supervised the transfer of Sarah to her uncle's, wrapping her in the heavy Navajo blanket and fixing a bed in the back of the wagon, holding Sarah's head in her lap during the journey. When she was fully recovered, Aunt Louisa was taken ill. Sarah stayed on with them and cared for her aunt and took care of the house. Uncle William was pleased to have her and told her she could stay as long as she wanted. It would take the burden of worry from his wife, and they both loved her and needed her. Jonathan was bitterly disappointed when he knew he'd lost his quote-unquote big sister. She was so wise, such a comfort to talk to. She had taught him much, and she herself had learned many helpful things while at the farm. Times were hard and getting harder. Many families lived on cornmeal when they could get it, made it into a gruel with water, and cooked with a little milk poured over it when possible. It was then that word came that Johnston's army was on its way, with instructions to exterminate those dreadful Mormons. As a last resort, President Brigham Young gave the order for the move, and each family packed all possible belongings and prepared their homes to be set to the torch if worst came to worst. They moved south to Provo, and it was while there that Thomas William Whitaker first saw Sarah, but they never met, and she did not remember ever seeing him at the time. Brigham Young met with Johnston, and they agreed that the army would not molest the Mormons. The army camped some miles outside the city, and no real harm was done to their homes. So they finally moved back and took up their abode once more in their own homes, and the army remained many weeks. Uncle William had one of the few better homes at the time, and, like his brother, was a meticulous, painstaking man. Yet he was not a patient individual, and he liked to give orders and see them obeyed. Little Will, now nearing the age of 2, was somewhat of a trial to him. He had one child by a former marriage to Emily Hill. They named her Aveline. Her mother had divorced him when he failed after 3 years in England to return home. It was to have been a 2-year mission. Why he overstayed in England remained a mystery. Sarah knew that she was greatly blessed to have a home with her uncle, and she did all in her power to show her appreciation by keeping the house spotless, fixing meals, doing work in the garden, and many other helpful deeds. Sarah and her mother kept in touch with Aunt Emily, as they called his former wife. She was a fine woman, and she married a man named Joseph Woodmansey and bore him 8 more children. She was a poetess and wrote many lovely poems for hymns, and also about pioneer life and the handcart company. And that's it for chapter 16. So now over these next few chapters, we're going to dive more into her life and see how it progressed after living with her aunt and uncle. So, does she remarry? And if so, to whom? Stay tuned to find out, and I'll see you next week for chapter 17.